IVM.
Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast supported by Pragati, a flagship media initiative of the Takshashila Institution. We're a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like to bring a fresh perspective to Indian affairs and an Indian perspective to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hello and welcome to All Things Policy. I'm Aditya Ramanathan, and I'm joined today by my fellow Aditya Pareek. And we're going to discuss space and specifically space stations, those sort of permanent or semi-permanent habitats in low Earth orbit. And we're talking about space stations because we are presently at a sort of turning point historically. The International Space Station, one of the most iconic structures that perhaps humans have built in modern history, has perhaps less than 10 years left before it re-enters the Earth's atmosphere and disintegrates and falls into the Pacific Ocean. And what's going to replace it is both uncertain and fascinating. We could see the rise of new commercial space stations. Russia and India plan to launch their own space stations. The Chinese already have the first module of their own space station in orbit. And so we're living in exciting times for space stations. And we'd just like to talk about it and what India should do in this situation. So firstly, welcome Aditya, and I'm glad we're finally getting to do an episode of All Things Policy after a really long time.
Thanks, Aditya. It's great to be back.
Yeah, and I want to get started with you on Russia specifically because Russians really are the pioneers of this whole business of space stations. This really starts in the 1970s with the Salyut series of stations. Can you just run us very quickly through what the Russians were trying to achieve with these very early orbital craft?
Hey, so as far as I understand it, the Salyut series of space stations that the Soviet Union put into orbit were pretty much scientific outposts. And although there was closely connected to military aspect to them, it wasn't really feasible, so to say, the way we think of space stations today. And they were, deorbited and put out of commission in a very short amount of time. So the Salyut series was also plagued by a few mission complications, engineering complications, as some good movies today would tell you in the Russian cinemasphere. So it really is a marvel of Soviet engineering, so to say, that when you look at orbital outposts, you see a very clear Russian lead during those times. And I'm sure we can also look at Skylab and other programs by NASA and the West along the same general idea. But I think the Salyut stations were pretty much, the very same kind of breakthrough for Russia, like their first satellite was.
Yeah, absolutely. The Soviets clearly had lead with the Salyuts, right? The Americans in turn had just one such space station, Skylab. And what is common to both Skylab and the Salyut series in the early days, in the 70s and the early 80s, is that, like you said, these were very short-lived, right? They would often just be in orbit for a few months before they would burn up and return to Earth in fragments. And typically they would only support one mission, right? So astronauts or cosmonauts would go on board these stations, work for a few weeks, and that was kind of it. What's really interesting is what happens by the early 80s. And this is the time when, for example, the Americans have started their space shuttle program. And they start talking, NASA especially starts talking about this whole idea of a continuous or permanent human presence in space. And it's billed as, supposedly the next logical step in space exploration. Now, why it is the next logical step is something that is much contested even today, and we will get into that. But this, in a sense, starts building the political capital and support in the United States for some sort of space station. And, there's an initial concept put up for a space station called Freedom, very imaginative name and so on. But once again, the Russians are really the first to the draw. And in 1986, they launched the core segment of the Mir space station, which is really the world's first modular space station, right? I mean, we take it for granted today. But until Mir, this idea of, a space station in segments over multiple launches was not something that had actually ever been implemented. And, that's, of course, how the International Space Station is also built today. But it was the Mir that really pioneered it. And Mir really matured in the years after the Cold War. By 1986, of course, the Cold War had eased up quite a bit with the coming of Mikhail Gorbachev. And from the 90s onwards, you start seeing collaboration between NASA and the Russians. What's also really interesting to me is that the Mir is the first time that you start seeing something like continuous presence of human beings in space, because from September 1989 to August 1999, a whole decade, you have cosmonauts always on the Mir space station. So it's really something remarkable. It is a major historical step in the human exploration of space.
Yeah, indeed. And I think it really makes sense that today there are parallels with the Chinese space station Tianhe, because, it's pretty much a smaller copy of the same concept. And I think there's enough research material. If you search for it, you'd find that it's pretty much an imitation of Mir, a ripoff if you would like. So I think the legacy of the Mir is pretty much something that we are still living with today in terms of the ISS and the cooperation between NASA and Roscosmos, the Russian state space company, and the way China has just ripped off the concept.
Absolutely, yeah. The Mir is definitely the pioneer, and you do see its legacy in the amazing space station that's up today, or the International Space Station. And really, that brings us to our times. What is the future of the International Space Station? It's hard to believe, but really, the International Space Station dates back to November 1998. It's now like 24 years old. It's a quarter of a century old. If you start considering it from its origins, or with the core module, which was built by Russia, the Zarya control module. And as soon after, you have other modules. Within 2 weeks, you have an American module. And by 2011, the ISS was the single largest human-made or artificial structure in space ever. Right, and it's still an amazing sight to see when you look at photos and when you look at footage, because there's absolutely nothing else like it in space, right? And this period between 98 and about 2011 is also the time when the American space shuttle program is still very much in operation, and it is helping to ferry cargo and people to the International Space Station. And then in 2011, it's at that time that the space shuttle program is shut down. And what happens now is that the Americans, who are actually providing the bulk of the funding and operation for the International Space Station, don't actually have any other way of getting people and cargo to and from this big craft orbiting the Earth at about 400 kilometers above sea level. And that's where they turn to the Russians. And for nearly a decade, for something like 8 years, it's the Russians that are actually ferrying people to the International Space Station. Aditya, this is a really remarkable period in cooperation between Russia and the United States, isn't it? Because it's also the time that relations start declining. The 90s and early 2000s were a time when relations were actually fairly stable, despite of the obvious problems that existed and that we're seeing manifested today. But it's also in that same period between 2012 and about 2020 that the Americans are completely dependent on the Russians for moving people to the International Space Station.
Yeah, absolutely. And that old adage about how Dmitry Rogozin, the state space company chief of Russia, said that the Americans would probably start using a trampoline if they won't to take our Soyuz flights to ferry people to the ISS. And how Elon Musk talked about that once his company started ferrying astronauts to ISS. So it's really, a clear cut to rise of a new space company, probably the most prosperous one in the world, SpaceX, which is pretty much driving this current era of, space becoming more accessible to enterprise as well as just about everybody in the world. So the way these things have moved, so SpaceX's rise is a lot more about mobility towards the orbit. So NASA really is thinking of private companies more because they bring in more prosperity in terms of cold hard cash if you talk about it, and having options. So the new space era is all about companies taking the initiative and governments taking slightly a backseat, and national space programs won't have to do everything on their own. That's the idea, diversification. So I think there's a clear pattern here that NASA first, I don't know whose initiative it was, if it was Elon Musk or SpaceX or NASA themselves. I haven't quite followed how the legislative and policy sphere in the US worked with that, but there's a clear pattern that they first talked about how to get to the orbit. Maybe it's a small thing about their being dependent on a country that they see as a sort of adversary, Russia, or maybe it's about just securing the first step first. So launching people to the orbit was the first step that they secured, and SpaceX has pretty much filled that role. And there are other Western companies as well which can now do mobility towards the orbit. And then currently, NASA, as far as I understand, is also looking at these outposts or space stations in orbit being privately owned as well. So, from what I understand, companies like Blue Origin and SpaceX obviously are interested in that as well. So, I think with NASA, it's all about to gradually shifting some of the burden that the National Space Program under NASA used to handle towards these companies as well, because well, it's the same thing everywhere in the world, that there are going to be sub-assemblies, there are going to be components which private enterprise would supply. Northrop Grumman and all those guys, Lockheed Martin, everybody provided components, but who's taking the whole charge of a specific mission component? That sort of a thing, I think NASA is now ready to think of.
That's interesting, Aditya. I'm glad you brought that up, and I want to discuss commercial participation in space more. But before we do that, let's take a quick break.
Hey everybody, it's been another great week on the IVM Podcast Network. On This Round is on Me, Gauri talks to Jinilia and Ritesh Deshmukh. They share how they gave up non-vegetarian food and started their plant-based meat venture, Imagine Meats. On Cyrus Says, Aisha joins Cyrus for their annual traditional Valentine's Day special. They debate who's the better parent, who's the better driver, who's the better haggler, and a whole lot more. On Hans Vani, catch the story Bhim Tola Ki Chokri. It follows the story of a young city woman who travels to the country to uplift the rural community population. On the Life Manifesto, Zarina explains how we can gather the courage to love again after being deeply hurt. And on Pulyabazi, Pranay and Saurav debate whether a wealth tax can solve economic inequality in their series Ek Sawal Kahi Jawab. Do follow us on social media. We're IVM Podcast on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn. And remember, if you're enjoying this show or any of our other shows for that matter, please do tell a friend. The word of mouth really helps. Also, don't forget to rate us on whatever platform you're listening to us, and check us out on YouTube. You can check a list of all our channels at ivmpodcast.com/YouTube. And finally, we'd like to thank our sponsors this week, Bank of Baroda and HDFC Life Insurance. Thank you so much for making this possible.
Welcome back to All Things Policy. There has always been in the US a strain of thought that was always believed that ultimately space needs to be privatized. And this isn't just dry government policy documents, but even American popular fiction and so on has always imagined a sort of private sector presence in space, and both dystopian and utopian visions of the urban future. So in that sense, it's not surprising. And we have seen for some years both established companies like Northrop Grumman and Boeing and Lockheed Martin lobbying for a greater role in space exploration. And they were, of course, joined about a decade back by these brash startups like SpaceX. What's really interesting is how much these companies have already achieved. It's now about a decade since SpaceX started ferrying cargo to the International Space Station. This isn't necessarily the most glamorous of aspects of space exploration, but it's one of those sort of literally workhorse tasks that really need to be done. And the fact that SpaceX has quietly mastered it is really impressive. Now, of course, SpaceX is not the only one. You also have the Cygnus spacecraft, which was developed by Orbital Sciences Corporation, which was later acquired by Northrop Grumman. And then you see a slightly different approach, perhaps from SpaceX, much more gradual, much more cautious sort of approach to space in general, which is typical of the American aerospace and defense companies. The Cygnus, for example, self-destructs upon re-entry into the Earth's atmosphere, whereas the SpaceX Dragon craft, of course, very much can re-enter the Earth's atmosphere, which is why you also now have Dragon spacecraft that are rated for cruise and are actually taking human beings to and from the International Space Station. The other thing is, like Aditya, like you talked about, NASA is already promoting and funding the commercial low Earth orbit destinations in space. And not all of these projects might actually succeed. I mean, you talked about companies like Blue Origin. Blue Origin has a very ambitious plan, and it calls its space station a mixed use business park, which is, a really fancy way of describing a series of modules in low Earth orbit. But basically what their idea is that, you could use the space station for multiple purposes. You could use a module for tourism. You could use a module for scientific experiments. Commercial enterprises could use one module, for example, to test a product and so on. And so, it's very clear actually that the business case for this sort of commercial low Earth orbit activity is not quite there yet. And companies like Blue Origin, Nanoracks, Northrop Grumman, which are all developing potential space stations, want to keep their options open and want to be flexible about what exactly people might use these space stations for. Now, obviously, one major customer is going to be NASA itself. So the way NASA sees it is it's better to just rent space on these space stations rather than maintain their own space station up there. And for them, that frees up both time, energy, people, all of these things for other more ambitious projects that NASA has. Things like pure sciences, astronomy, just looking up into space with telescopes, but also ambitious exploration projects like lunar exploration and eventually going to Mars. NASA, of course, is leading the so-called Artemis lunar exploration program, just like the Chinese and Russians have their own ILRS program. So the idea is really to free up time, resources, and people to carry out more ambitious tasks. And what is unclear, though, is whether this will succeed, right? So NASA has in the past claimed that they would save somewhere between 1.3 to 1.8 billion dollars within the first couple of years of the operation of such commercial space stations. But it's not actually clear that this will happen or if these space stations will actually succeed. And remember that the Americans had initially envisioned decommissioning the International Space Station by 2024. They have now extended that to 2030. And the plan is to, in January of 2031, to finally decommission the International Space Station. So I'd say NASA's plans are very ambitious. They're absolutely fascinating, but I think we should hold our breath in our judgment to see what exactly happens. Now, of course, the other point to make here is that competition isn't just going to come from other private corporations, but also from other states. And that's where Russia comes in. Russia has been kind of exasperated by the International Space Station for some time. And it's clear that they want to go it on their own. Aditya, can you just tell us about what Russia's plans are for their own space station?
Yeah, sure. Be glad to. So, as the last point that you mentioned about Russia being aggravated with the current state of the ISS. So, as you know, there are cracks in some of the modules, which are pretty much part and parcel of the age of the station. And it's quite a bit of work for their cosmonauts to seal those cracks. And it takes a toll for all those spacewalks and all the technical expertise that you need to maintain such an old station. So yeah, ISS, as soon as it's out of the way, the better, because it's a catastrophic threat, as they've said, the Russians themselves, past expiration date. So yeah, as soon as it's out of the picture, the better. And as a replacement, they're thinking of a unilateral space station called ROSS, the ROS. So the acronym expands to Russian Orbital Service Station. So it's a unilateral space station that the state enterprise Energia is building, and their primary component assemblies and all are going to be finished by 2025 or so, they hope. And as far as I understand, no other country has actually tied up with Russia for the production of the station or the launch of the station as of now. And the Chinese, which are being seen as these staunch geopolitical allies, or rather a pragmatic geopolitical allies, depending on who you ask, they have their unilateral space station as well. So, yeah, it's a bit of a contrast to the way things are moving in Russia, China's world, and the way it's moving in NASA's world and ESA's world or JAXA's world. So, I think Russia and China still think in terms of early Cold War as far as space stations are concerned. So their model is very reminiscent of the early Cold War period, where unilateral space stations were the norm. And I think it's quite a bit of a thing that they didn't pursue a joint permanent presence project together and instead went for unilateral ones. And I think there's an opportunity for India there, which is also thinking of semi-permanent or permanent presence in space. But the first step for that is the upcoming, very soon to be launched to human spaceflight project, the Gaganyaan mission. So I think the way ISRO is talking about how the technology for an Indian space station would come out of that project to and the further developments from the learnings there, I think India signing up with Russia for ROSS would make kind of sense. So yeah, that's what my take is on it.
Yeah, we should really think about what India's options are because, like you said, we have very different approaches with the United States on the one hand and Russia and China on the other. China's approach is very much reminiscent of Russia's. In fact, both, of course, like the US and Russia, they did first start by launching these short lived sort of space labs in 2011 and 2016. That's the route India is also inevitably going to take. And then eventually they launched last year in 2021. So the Chinese have already launched the core module of this space station, the Tiangong, and it's got a crew on board right now of taikonauts. And the Chinese plan to have this space station continually inhabited for the next 10 years. So they're also looking very much at a sort of permanent presence in space. And furthermore, they also plan to launch the remaining two modules of the Tiangong this year, 2022. So, basically they want to really quickly finish building this space station. Obviously, with just three modules, it's going to be much smaller than the International Space Station, but as a first shot at a space station, it's really impressive. And so, right now, I mean, if you look at where India is, you have the amazing International Space Station, which is unfortunately aging and is on its way out. And you have a great deal of promise, but uncertainty with the commercial space stations. You have the Russians planning their own space station, and given their experience in this field, there's no doubt that they can pull it off so long as they have the funding. And so, where does India fit into all this? You had mentioned the Gaganyaan program, right? So, India's own cosmonauts are training currently in Russia, but it's not clear when exactly we'll pull this off. We were hoping to have the first leg of Gaganyaan, which involved putting out a humanoid robot into space and so on. The idea was for this to happen last year, but because of the COVID pandemic and the disruptions it caused, that's supposed to happen now in 2022. And eventually in 2023, we are supposed to launch the first Indian into space from an Indian rocket. Now that's obviously the first step to eventually even thinking about creating some sort of habitat in space. But the idea is, at least the Union Minister for Science and Technology, Jitendra Singh, had said last year in December that the idea is to get an Indian space station up and running in 2030. Presumably, this will not be a modular space station, and it's probably going to be a short-lived craft that stays in space for a few months, perhaps supports one mission, and basically serves as a sort of experiment. But if India is able to pull that off, it would be really amazing. Having said that, even if India does meet the schedule by 2030, that's also the time that the International Space Station is scheduled for destruction. We might already by then see a Russian space station already in orbit, at least perhaps a core module of such a station. And we're also likely to see the first attempts at commercial space stations by this time. And so, even if India meets its own deadlines, it is going to be far behind a lot of these countries, right? Now, there is a benefit to starting out and figuring out these things ab initio on your own. But really, if India intends to maintain some sort of continuous presence in space, given the sheer expenses, given the fact that India is behind, it really makes a lot of sense for India to collaborate, right? So now the good thing for India is that we can collaborate with both the United States and Russia. China is a different ballgame altogether, and we don't really need to collaborate with them right now. But the United States and Russia are open to cooperation with India. And there is a lot of opportunity for India to collaborate with commercial American companies, with NASA directly, and of course with the Russians. Indians can build subsystems, Indians can build modules for space stations. We can rent space on other space stations, and all of this will give us the sort of experience we need to operate in space without, trying to go alone and, trying to build our own modular space station from scratch. And, even if we eventually do that, and that's perfectly fine, any such Indian space station should be built in collaboration with private enterprise, and there should be a business case for it by then. So, I don't believe that India should just put up a space station out there simply because, India is this big space power and we need to do what the other countries are doing. We really need to figure out how to marshal our resources and use them intelligently.
Yeah, I agree. And I think going a bit of on a specific tangent here, but the way I think of Ross is that Russia needs funding badly for its space station, and India needs a leg up in catching up to the technology and the industrial base. So I see two negatives here becoming a positive if you just put them together. So India, however, if it ties up with Roscosmos and Russia, for joining the ROSS program, we should think in terms of, owning the modules for which we provide the funding partially, or, being in charge of those modules. Because the ultimate goal for the Indian national interest is to absorb as much technology as we can and become as self-reliant as we can. So here the idea should always be about getting the skills, the know-how, the technology, as much of it as possible, and taking charge of the modules that we partially or fully fund is the only way that I see ROSS would make sense to ISRO and India's national interest. So, Russia has been very willing to transfer its technology. Even if you go back to the 90s and think about the JSLV and all. So the problem there, obviously, the controversy was about the US's insistence that it was about the MTCR and all that. And, it's a different can of worms. But the idea is that I think, be it the life support systems for Gaganyaan or the special space suits or training our cosmonauts, and I'm glad that you called them cosmonauts. And I think this trend of India-Russia space cooperation is going to go forward. And I have a firm belief that Russia's space station is pretty much going to fit into the schedule that we're thinking of for the Indian space station as well. And it just all around makes sense if Roscosmos is ready to transfer some of the technology and let us take charge of some of the modules.
Yeah, I agree that this is one option that Indians are definitely going to be looking at, as well as Russians, because it makes sense. There is a history of Russia space cooperation. People know each other, and it's much easier to strike a deal in such circumstances. What will be interesting is to see how Indians also figure out how we can commercialize the low Earth orbit. Because ultimately, if we really want humans to be in space permanently, it is going to be at low Earth orbit, at least for the near future. And for even that to sustain over the coming decades, it absolutely is going to require there to be a commercial case for it. So, it can start off with something as simple as tourism. But, one challenge that we've seen with, for example, the International Space Station is, the critics point out that a lot of the experiments that have been conducted on board the International Space Station, using the microgravity environment, don't really provide bang for the buck. You could potentially carry out some similar experiments on Earth, or, they haven't really yielded a lot of results. And we don't know if that's going to change. That's one thing. So does it really make sense to do a lot of scientific research, for example, in a microgravity environment? Secondly, is it useful to do commercially applicable experiments or development in such environments? And unless these are resolved, we are not going to necessarily find an easy way to commercially sustain humans in space, unless, it's all about tourism, which I suspect is going to be the first application, right? There's world's full of rich people, and a lot of them will have money to literally burn on rocket fuel to send them into orbit for a few minutes or a few hours or a few days. So I suspect that is going to be one of the first applications of a business in the lower the orbit environment. And it's something where, if there are opportunities for India to react, it absolutely should. We must find a commercial case for this. And, if that doesn't exist, I would think that humans should actually have the humility to decide, well, then maybe, it doesn't make sense to always have human beings in low Earth orbit. It doesn't mean we don't want to explore the inner solar system, but it just means that we should figure out more sustainable ways of doing that. Anyway, as these are questions to which I suspect we'll get answers only about 20 years from now. And I really hope that we can figure out ways to keep humans in space constantly. And who knows, some of our listeners, for example, might get an opportunity to see what the Earth looks like when you leave it. Anyway, thank you so much, Aditya. Love to do more of these episodes on space exploration and space policy with you in the coming weeks. And if you'd like to hear more such episodes, if you'd like us to discuss more topics related to space, do let us know. And we'd love to see how we can incorporate those topics into All Things Policy. Thank you so much.
If you liked our show, don't forget to check out other interesting podcasts on the IVM network. You can tune into them on the IVM Podcast app, ivmpodcast.com, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. You can also follow IVM on social media. The handle is @IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And hey, if you'd like to dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs, check us out at our Twitter handle @TakshashilaINST or our website takshashila.org.in.
Do you like true crime stories?
Do you like to learn about the people behind some horrible, awful crimes?
More specifically, women that may have committed these crimes.
Actually, Indian criminals that are women?
Then we'd like to welcome you to our podcast, Misconduct. My name is Raghavi.
And I am Nisha.
We cover themes like murder, dacoity, drug trafficking, financial fraud, kidnapping, and many more.
You can catch us every Wednesday on the IVM Podcast Network or wherever you get your podcast.
A wise man once said, traveling, it makes you speechless, then turns you into a storyteller. Well, listen to such travel stories and experiences exploring India on the Musafir Stories with us, Saif and Faiza.
Catch us on the IVM website, app, or wherever you get your podcasts from.